Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery! Hey! We've got our live virtual studio audience on Zoom with us as we delve into the exciting world of the final chapter of Masechet Bechorot. And with this, we will be completing another Masechta and edging ever closer to the completion of Sefer Kodshim, which is an exciting and huge milestone. So, ladies and gentlemen, join me in chapter 9 of Masechet Bechorot. We're going to get it up for you on the screen as well. There we go. Now we can all see that. Excellent. And we will go into this together, talking about Maaser Behema. So we're familiar with crops that need to be tithed, taking 10%. But did you know that you also have to take 1 out of every 10 of your animals also for the Beis Hamikdash? And you're not supposed to do anything with it other than to take it as a korban, if it's in the time of the temple, or to wait until it develops a blemish, in which case then you'd be able to use it. But until that point, you can't shear it. If it's a sheep, you can't work with it. You can't set it to work. And we're going to see that it applies to sheep, to cows, and to goats. So interestingly though, even though the Torah says that it should be a korban, right, each of these 1 every 10 animals, it's still going to apply everywhere, whether you are in the Beis Hamikdash or not in the Beis Hamikdash, whether you are in Eretz Yisrael or not in Eretz Yisrael. So says the Mishnah, Maaser Behema in Perek Tes, Mishnah Aleph, chapter 9, Mishnah 1. Maaser Behema noheg ba'aretz v'chutz la'aretz. The mitzvah of tithing your animals applies in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. Bifnei habayis v'shelo bifnei habayis. Whether it's with the temple standing or without. Or even if you're in the presence of the temple or not in the presence of the temple. Bachulin aval lo b'mukdashin. So it applies to chulin, to non-sanctified animals, but not with regards to animals which have been set aside for sacrifice. Says the Mishnah, v'noheg babakar uvatson, and it applies to bakar, which is cattle, and son, which is flock animals. Which in this context means sheep and goats. So it applies to cows, cattle, and it applies to sheep and goats. Ve'enon misasrin mizeh al zeh. However, says the Mishnah, if you have 5 cows and 5 sheep, then they don't combine to make 10 animals from which you could tithe. Bakvasim uvayizim, they apply to sheep and they apply to goats. Umisasrin mizeh al zeh. But if you have 5 goats, let's say, and 5 sheep, then you would be able to take maaser from those 10 animals, even though they are different species. And if you had, for example, 10 sheep and 10 goats, then you could even take 2 sheep or 2 goats as your maaser, right? Even though you've got 20 animals, you might think, well, I've got to take at least 1 sheep and at least 1 goat. Says the Mishnah over here that you could actually take 2 sheep, even though you've got loads of goats there as well. Says the Mishnah, Bechadash uvayashan. So we're going to see soon that there is a time frame from which Maaser applies, right? Which may have come intuitively to some of you, right? But if you think about it, there's going to be a cutoff point for 1 year's worth of tithes, for 1 year's worth of animals that you would need to tithe from. So Bechadash, it would apply to a new year's worth of animals, uvayashan, and it would apply equally if you have not yet tithed last year's cattle that were born within that certain time frame. You would still need to tithe them. Ve'enon misasrim mizeh al zeh. But if I've got 5 animals born this year and 5 animals born last year, they don't combine to make 10 animals for you to tithe from. Shahaya badin, and we would have said that this is logical. Ma imachadash v'hayashan. When it comes to new animals and old animals, the new flock and the old flock, she'enan kilayim zeh bazeh, where they're the same species, they're just from different time periods, right? So you're not going to violate the law of kilayim, of having, if they were to not populate, if they were to mate. If they were to mate, they wouldn't be violating the laws of kilayim because they're the same species. They're just from two different time periods. And yet the halacha is that you can't tithe even within one species. You can't tithe from an old flock with a new flock. So then we should apply the same logic. Hakvasim v'hayizim, when it comes to sheep and goats, shehem kilayim zebazeh, where if they were to mate, you would be violating kilayim. You would be violating the mitzvah of of two species mixing together. So surely the logic should be that you can't tithe a group of sheep and goats together, right? Because you could be violating the laws of kilayim. They're clearly a different species. So my logic would tell me that if I can't even tithe the same species, one, from previous year and from the current year, if I can't tithe those, then surely I shouldn't be able to tithe sheep and goats together. How does that make sense? But the Mishnah says, Talmud Lomar, that's why the pasuk comes to say, Vatson. When the verse talks about the mitzvah of tithing animals applying to the flock, and says the pasuk in the English over there on the screen, and all the tithe of the herd or the flock, whatever passes under the rod, the 10th shall be sacred to the Lord. So the fact that it says vatson, talking about a flock animal, mashma kolson echad. This implies that anything that falls under the category of tson, which would be sheep and goats, echad, they are going to be considered as one species for all intents and purposes with regards to the mitzvah of Ma'aseh Behema. And as we move on to Mishnah Base, we're going to be looking at the question of how close do the animals need to be considered as one group to be able to tithe from. If I've had an animal born in London and I own another animal and that's born in Manchester, are they considered to be, counting towards the 10, or are they too far apart? So how far apart do they have to be before they become exempt from being tithed or being counted together? And what we're going to see is it's going to be dependent on the distance an animal will travel to pasture. So it says the Mishnah in Mishnah Base, scrolling down on the screen, can't forget that, it's been so long since we've been together. Ma'aseh behema mitztaref kimlo regel behema ro'ah. The group size, right? The animals will join together and combine together to be counted together as long as they are within reasonable walking distance for an animal to graze. V'chamahi regel behema ro'ah. And how far is this distance for a grazing animal to walk? Says the Mishnah, Shisha Asar mil. It is a distance of 16 mil. So if 1 mil is approximately 3.2 miles, so it's going to be 16 times 3.2, which for all those accountants is a very big number. If they are more than 16 mil apart, then that is going to be patur. They're going to be exempt from being counted together. Haya bein elu le'elu shloshim u'shnayim mil. If there are 32 mil between the two flocks, the two herds, whatever it might be, einan mitzdarfin, then they're not going to combine together. But, says the Mishnah, Haya lo be'emsa, let's say you've got a flock over there and a flock over there, and there's 32 mil between them. But Haya lo be'emsa, but there's another animal in between, right? Maybe umasran be'emsa. So if that animal is now creating a distance of 16 mil between the most external flocks or herds, so then you're going to create a situation where they can all be linked together, because now you've only got 16 mil between one set and 16 mil between the second set in relation to that one animal that's in the middle. So if you've got an animal in the middle, or a group in the middle, then you're going to combine all of the outermost animals as well. Rabbi Meir says, Hayardein mafsik l'ma'aseh behema, that, as we said, you have to tithe animals outside of Eretz Yisrael as well. But nonetheless, the Jordan River, which, yes, would have been part of Eretz Israel anyway, historically. But the Jordan River divides animals which are on two sides of the river. So even if they're very close proximity, if there's a river that is dividing them, then it's going to create two groups. So even though they might be close, they are nonetheless going to be separate and not be considered as one group for the sake of tithing. Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Gimel. The Mishnah discusses which type of animals are chayev in ma'aseh behema. You have to tithe if they are owned in partnership. So if you have got two people, let's say, who own a particular animal or group of animals, are those animals going to be liable, obligated in the mitzvah of tithing or not? And it's going to depend on whether they own the animal or whether it was received as a gift, whether the animal was born to them, whether they have a formal partnership, whether they've inherited the animals. So there's going to be a lot of factors that we have to take into account. And if it's not confusing yet at the beginning, it's going to get more confusing halfway through. So here we go. Halakuach. If you purchase an animal, or shinitan lo matana, or it's given to you as a gift, then the Mishnah says, patur mima'aseh behema. Then you're going to be exempt from tithing the animal. Ha'achim, right, because it wasn't born to you. Ha'achim hashutafim, if you have brothers who are in partnership, shechayevin bekalbon, who are obligated in paying the bonus. What are we talking about? Well, we're going to have to cast our minds back to Masechet Shekalim. And in Masechet Shekalim, when we were talking about the need to give your compulsory machatzit hashekel, so we talked about if two people come together, if they are in partnership, right? So then they are going to perhaps have to pay an added premium in their annual payment to the temple. Okay? And the point here that we're trying to make is that if these partners are such that it would obligate them in this additional bonus payment, right? We saw this back in Shekalim as well. Any partnership which would be obligated in the kalbon, in the bonus payment, is going to be exempt from taking ma'aseh behema. So that's what the Mishnah is trying to tell us over here. That if you have partners, brothers who are partners, who would be obligated in giving the bonus, they are going to be paturim in ma'aseh behema. They are going to be exempt from giving from tithing their animals. Conversely, the shechayavin b'ma'aseh behema, if they are obligated in the mitzvah of tithing their animals, then you can be assured paturin min hakalbon. It's going to be the type of partnership where they would not be obligated to give this additional bonus sum. Kanu mitfusas habayis. If they purchase animals as through inheritance from the property in the possession of their father's house, meaning it's the property of the Yerusha, the property of the inheritance, says the Mishnah, chayavin. They are going to be obligated in tithing the animals. V'im lav, and if not, if they didn't buy from these household assets that they had received, that they had inherited, rather they had inherited the assets, divided them amongst themselves, and then used those funds to buy the animals. So if that's what you've done, then the Mishnah says, Paturin, you would be exempt. So if you've used the inherited assets before they get divided up, then it would be chayav. Then the animals would be obligated in ma'aseh. And if you had divided up the assets first, and then you were using your funds to buy these animals, Paturin, you'll be exempt. Chalku v'chazru v'nishtatfu, says the Mishnah. If you divided up the inheritance, then you re-entered into a partnership, then the Mishnah says, Chayavim b'kalbon. In this instance, they would be obligated to give the bonus payment, which would mean the Paturin v'ma'aseh behema. They would be exempt from taking the animal tithes. Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Daled. The Torah tells us that if ma'aseh behema, if the tithed animals are invalid to be used as a korban, then they can be eaten, but there are limitations to the way that they can be eaten. Says the Mishnah, Hakol nichnas ladir lehisasher. All of these animals, all these cattle, all these sheep, all these goats can go into the pen in order to be tithed, chutz min hakilayim, except for animals which have been crossbred, e.g., For example, you have crossbred a goat with a sheep, and then the offspring of that animal can now not be included in the count. Vahatrefa, or an animal which is which has been so mortally wounded that it will be dying within a year. V'yotze dofen, or an animal which was born through cesarean section. Umechusar zman. What is mechusar zman? Mechusar zman is an animal which is too young. It has to be at least 8 days old before the deadline of Maaser for it to then be counted in that particular group. V'yason, or if it's an orphan, meaning that the mother, well, we're going to see what it means. Asks the Mishnah, Ezehu Yasom, what is an orphaned animal? Kol Shemesa Imo or Shinishchata. If the mother has died within those 8 days, or it has been killed so early on, so then it's going to be considered an orphan and it's not going to be included in the count for Ma'aser Behema. Rabbi Yeshua says, Afilu Nishchata Imo v'hashelach kayam ein ze yason. Even if the mother was slaughtered, but the hide is still intact, so you could wrap the hide around the baby animal, and so it would think that it's still got its mother close to him, so then it would not be considered an orphan, and it would be considered in the count for Ma'aser Behema. Mishnah, hey, there is a biblical obligation to tithe, but once a year. However, since they wanted, the Rabbanan, the Chachamim, wanted to maintain a flow of animals into the marketplace, they said that you should tithe 3 times a year, and that you can't have any benefit until you've actually done the tithing, right? So within 1 year, you can combine animals into groups and tithe them from there. But the point is that there would be 3 junctures, 3 seasons throughout the year, 3 dates, in which people would be encouraged to tithe, because in so doing, they would maintain a good flow of animals coming into the market. Says the Mishnah, Shalosh granot l'ma'aser behema. There are 3 harvesting times. It's interesting that they use an agricultural word to explain this, but there are 3 essentially harvesting periods, as it were, where we're talking about Ma'aser Behema, but using an agricultural term. So there are 3 seasons for tithing your animals. Says the Mishnah, the first position, which is Rabbi Akiva, Befros HaPesach. Befros HaPesach, so adjacent to Pesach. So what this means is 15 days before the festival of Pesach, which, according to Rabbi Akiva, could sometimes be the 29th of Adar, could sometimes be the 30th of Adar, depending on whether it was a leap year or not. That's going to be significant to us in a minute. So that would be the first season, close to Pesach, within 15 days. Bifros Hatzeres, close to Shavuot. Bifros Hechag, and close to Sukkos, Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai says that he's going to agree that you have to have this closeness, this proximity to Pesach, but he would always hold that Adar is always 29 days. So that's why Ben Azai can definitively say Be'esrim v'tisha ba'Adar, that it's always going to be the 29th of Adar, which is also 15 days before Pesach, but he is very adamant that there will only be 29 days in that month. Be'echad b'Sivan, right? So Be'echad b'Sivan is not 15 days before Shavuot, it's a few days only, it's a week before Shavuot, and therefore, because there won't have been so many animals born, right, you can afford to get a bit closer to Shavuot. It always made me. This always makes me think, Richard, of the baby blessings that we used to do in Lahavdil, that we used to do in Bushi, where you do it on Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and you'd be like, how many babies could have possibly been born between Pesach and Shavuot? But anyway, so the second date is the 1st of Sivan, and then the third date, Be'esrim. Pardon me?
It depends what was in the water.
Depends what was in the water. And then the third day, Be'esrim v'tisha b'Av, the 29th day of Av. And this is interesting. This is because, according to Ben Azai, he wasn't sure if the cutoff point, if the cycle started and finished on the 1st of Elul or the 1st of Tishrei. So because of that uncertainty, he says the date should be the 29th of Adar, whereas Rabbi Akiva holds that it's the 1st of Tishrei, and that's why he says close to the festival of Sukkot. 15 days before Sukkot, of course, is the first of Tishrei. So that's the second opinion. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon Omrim. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon say be'echad b'Nisan. It's going to be 2 weeks before Pesach, as opposed to the 29th of Adar. Be'echad b'Sivan. It's going to be the 1st of Sivan, agreeing with Ben Azai over there. Be'esrim v'tisha be'elul. And they're going to agree with Rabbi Akiva for the cutoff point being the 1st of Tishrei, and so 15 days before Sukkot would be the 29th of Elul. And in so doing, the 1st of Tishrei starts the new count, as it were, the new can't think what the word is, the cutoff point for creating new herds and new flocks. So why, Mishnah asks, do they hold that it's the 29th day of Elul and not the 1st of Tishrei? Because the 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah. And it's impossible, it's not permitted to tithe on Yom Tov. Therefore they bring it 1 day forward, and the tithing cutoff point is the 29th of Elul. Rabbi Meir says, Be'echad be'elul, Rosh Hashanah l'maaseh behema. So it would seem that he must agree with everybody else regarding the first 2 dates, and then his third date, that 1st of Elul, being the Rosh Hashanah, the starting point for tithing a new round of animals, because he would seem to hold, therefore, that the 1st of Elul is the Rosh Hashanah for this, he would seem to be agreeing with Ben Azai. And Ben Azai Omer ha'eluliyin misasrim b'fnei atzman. It would seem that Ben Azai might even have a 4th date over here, and any animals born in Elul would be tithed by themselves. Because of this uncertainty as to whether the cutoff point is the 1st of Elul or the 1st of Tishrei. Therefore, Ben Azai would say, to avoid that doubt, that month of Elul has its own tithing period. Fascinating nonetheless. Moving on to Mishnah Vav. Kol hanoladim me'echad b'tishrei ad esrim v'tisha be'elul harei elu mitztarfin. So we were alluding to this before. If the animal was born between the 1st of Tishrei of one year and the 29th of Elul of that year, right, that is our yearly cycle. Okay, so any animal born in that time can be tithed together, but as we said, there are 3 seasons where you would take an opportunity to tithe your animals. So they can all be tithed together during that time. Chamisha lifnei Rosh Hashanah v'chamisha la'achar Rosh Hashanah. If you have 5 animals born before Rosh Hashanah and 5 animals born after Rosh Hashanah, einam mitztarfin, they don't combine because they were born either side of the cutoff point. Chamisha lifnei hagoren v'chamisha la'achar hagoren. If you have 5 born before one seasonal date and 5 born after that seasonal date, Hare Elu Mitzdarfin, then they can combine because they are within that one yearly cycle of births. Im Kain, Lama Ne'emar Shlosh Goranos Lamas Behema. If so, why do we need 3 seasons? Says the Mishnah, Sha'ad Shelo Higia Goren, Mutar Limkor V'Lishchot. Because as long as you haven't reached those next dates, you would actually be allowed to sell and slaughter your animals. Higia Hagoren, once those times would come, then lo yishchot, you wouldn't be able to slaughter the animals before tithing them. V'im shachat, and if you did, patur, then you would be exempt from, I guess, any punishment, is that? Or you would be exempt from any punishment. So you're not supposed to do it, but you wouldn't have any liability if you did. So, we've talked enough about tithing. What does it actually look like? What do we actually do? So says the Mishnah in Mishnah Zion, Ketzad Ma'asra. How do you actually do the process of tithing? Says the Mishnah, Konsan Ladir. You bring all the animals into a pen. Va'oseh lahen Pesach Katan. And you make a small opening. Kadei shelo yihiyu shenayin yecholim latzeis ka'achas. In order that you won't be able to get 2 animals going out at once, right? So you're creating an opening, and the only option is going to be for the animals to move through in single file. Umone vashevet. I mean, you're going to have a stick, you're going to have a staff that you're going to use to count the animals as they come through. Echad, shnayim, shlosha, arba, chamisha, shisha, shiva, shmona, tisha. You're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. V'hayotze asiri, and the one that comes out 10th, sokra b'sikra, you're going to hit it with, or you're going to smear on it red paint using your stick. Va'omer harei ze ma'aseh. This is important. You have to declare that this animal is the 10th animal of that count. Lo sekara b'sikra. If you didn't smear it with the red paint, v'lo na'am b'shevet, and you didn't count it with the staff as you are supposed to, or says the Mishnah, or shemna'am revutzin, or you counted the animals when they were crouched instead of walking through, or omdin, or the animals were standing in place but they weren't walking through. So says the Mishnah, Harei elu meusarim, they are going to be considered as having been tithed. Hayalom mea v'natal asara, but if you've got 10, if you've got 100 animals, and you take out 10 of those animals, or asara v'natal echad, or you've got 10 animals and you take out 1, right? Then ein zeh ma'aseh. Then it's not going to have been considered as tithed because you've not actually counted. The counting would seem to be the most important element according to this position in the Mishnah. There has to be counting for it to have been considered to have been tithed. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Harei zeh ma'aseh, but Rabbi Yossi ben son of Yehuda disagrees and says that would also be considered as being tithed. What about some of the problems that you could encounter during counting? Right, we're dealing with lively animals over here. Kafatz echad min hamenuyin l'socham. What if you've already counted an animal, but it jumps back into the pen? Says the Mishnah, Harei elu p'turim. So it's already been counted. It doesn't have to be counted again. And not only that, but it's now going to exempt all of the other animals from being tithed, because maybe the one that you're counting is the one that you've already counted. So it's going to excuse you from having to tithe any further animals. Says the Mishnah, Min ha'ma'usarin l'socham. Sorry, so that first case was if they had been counted but not set aside as a tithe, right? So it's one of the first 9, let's say. So if one of those first 9 jump back in, so it's already been counted out, you're not going to have to tithe any further because you might have already counted that animal. Says the Mishnah though, Min ha'ma'usarim l'socham. If you've got one of your tithed animals which now has this additional sanctity infused into it, and that one jumps back into the pen, now we have a problem. Kulan yiru al she'istoavu. Now we've got a problem that we don't know which of the animals was already tithed. It could be any of the ones that we're taking out. So we could have a problem because that animal has been tithed. So the Mishnah says you have to just leave all of them to graze until they become unfit for sacrifice, and then and then they can be eaten in a blemished state by the owner once it's developed this blemish. So it knocks out your ability to use them the way that you might have intended, because they will have been corrupted by this tithed animal diving back in. And for our final Mishnah, it is such a shame that I don't really understand this brilliantly, but I'll do my best to explain it. And that will complete for us Maseches Bechorot. So Mishnah Ches, the final Mishnah of chapter 9 and of Masechet Bechorot. Various ways to count. So Yatsu Shnayim Ke'echad. If you have 2 animals coming out at once, so Mone Osan Shnayim Shnayim. So you can count them 2 by 2. Mna'am Echad. If you counted 1, if you counted 2 of the animals and you counted them as 1, so now you're going to ruin the rest of the counting that you're doing, right? So 2 animals come through and you count that as only 1 animal having passed. So now the subsequent animals are going to be flawed. It means Tashiv Asiri Mikukalin. The 9th and the 10th are flawed because the one that you've just called 9 was actually the 10th, but you don't know what's going on. Yatsu Tashi'i Va'asiri Ka'achas. If the 9th and the 10th one come out in one go, and you only call it 9, Tashi'i Va'asiri Mikukalin, so the 9th and the 10th are going to be mekukalin. They are going to be flawed. It's going to be a problem. Kara latashi'i asiri. If the 9th animal comes out and you call that one 10, v'la asiri tashi'i. The 10th animal comes out and you call that one the 9th. Ulachad asar asiri. And the 11th one comes out and you've called that one the 10th. The Mishnah says, Shlashdan mekudashin. All 3 of these animals are now going to have halachic status as a tithe, because the 9th one was actually the 10th. You've labelled the 9th one as 10, and you've labelled the 11th one, and that one was 10. So now you've got 3 which are actually the tithe. Hatashi'i ne'echal b'muma. The 9th one can be eaten in its blemished state. V'ha'asiri ma'aseh. The 10th one will be a tithe. V'achad asar karev shlamim. The 11th one can be offered up as a shlamim sacrifice. Va'oseh tamura, and it could be used in an exchange. We haven't really covered tamura yet, but when we come to talking about substitute offerings, then this will make more sense. So according to Rabbi Meir, Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's what can be done with the 11th one. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, however, V'chi yesh tamura oseh tamura. Can a substitute now render another animal a substitute? This 11th one, which he called 10, which is a substitute for the Ma'aseh, would in theory, according to Rabbi Yehuda, be considered a Tamurai substitute. So how can you now have the substitute becoming a substitute for something else? So it would seem then that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with this. Amru Mishum Rabbi Meir. So they answered on behalf of Rabbi Meir, Ilu haya tamura lo haya karev. If it was a substitute, it would not be sacrificed, because a substitute tithed animal cannot be sacrificed. And I suppose then, if we're saying that it can be sacrificed, Rabbi Meir would say that it's not considered to be tamura. Oh, makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Kara la tashi'i asiri. If you call the 9th animal the 10th, v'la asiri, and then you call the 10th one also the 10th, v'la achad asar asiri, and then you call the 11th one the 10th. So says the Mishnah, Ein achad asar mekudash. The 11th one is not consecrated. And that will be because, I guess, so that's going to be fundamentally because the issue is if you get that 10th one wrong. So in the first case, we called the 10th one number 9. But because it was the 10th, it was nonetheless a sacred animal. It was nonetheless a mice animal. But here, we're calling the 9th one 10, which is a problem. That's going to make it miser. We're calling the 10th one 10, which is fine. And we've called the 11th one 10. Well, that's irrelevant now because we know that we've got a 10th one being 10. Oh, perfect sense. So the 11th one is not going to be sanctified. Zeh HaKlal, says the Mishnah to finish off. This is the rule. As long as you haven't ruined the name of the 10th animal, as long as you've not uprooted the 10th animal from its official name, Ein achad asar mekudash. So then the 11th one is not going to be consecrated. It's not going to be considered ma'aseh. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude together. Let's unmute ourselves and say the classic formula. Wish ourselves mazel tov and say Nishlama Maseches Bechoros, Nishlama Maseches Bechoros, Nishlama Maseches Bechorot. Mazel tov, everybody, on finishing Maaseh Bechorot. And that's all we've got time for this week. Join us next week when we will, please God, go into Maseches Erechim. And I love this guy. There is someone who seems to tune in to this particular stream and leave the most bizarre comments on YouTube. And then it disappears after we finish the recording. So I really hope, Wesley Curry II, that you're having a good time. But your comments are a bit weird. Anyway, that's all we've got time for. We will see you all again on Mishnah Mastery. Mazel tov again. See you next time. And